Evening. My name is Hank Mayers, and I'm pleased to welcome you to my boot camp for reforming money in our politics. In today's session, I'll be discussing the subject of political dark money and how it invades our elections. So sit back for the next 45 minutes while I elaborate on the various ways that dark money is seriously and massively invading America's elections. So, what does the term dark money suggest to you? Maybe you think that it's a nefarious practice like we can see in this image. Here we have Bagman Bart carrying around a bag of cash to distribute under the cloak of darkness. You'd be in good company if that was your presumption of how this works. However, it's something that's not done in the secrecy of the dark. It's done totally out in the open, using legitimate banking processes and the like. And worse yet, it's totally legal. So what is dark money? It's money whose sources are unknown. In that sense, it's secret money. But as you will see in a little while, it is only a secret from the voters. So what's the source of this dark money? Well, actually, it comes from lots of sources. As we'll see, the first one, the 501c4s and other nonprofit advocacy groups, are a major source of dark money. That's because a court, in this case, it was the Supreme Court of the United States, SCOTUS, they rendered a decision in 1955 and did some very loose interpretation in some later cases, granted all nonprofits privacy rights, so to assure their ability to associate freely without retribution or coercion. One of the newer devices to keep donations secret, the second one in this list, is the donor-directed charity funds. These are politically oriented 501c3 foundations. We're going to take a deep dive on these folks a little later in this presentation. A third source of dark money is limited liability corporations. And these are generally set up by an individual donor or some businesses. It's generally becoming less favored in preference to campaign engaged nonprofits like the one that's first on our list. I'll talk a little bit later about another significant source of dark money, which is item 4, the late filing groups. They spend the bulk of their money after the last financial report is submitted before the election. Now, source number 5 is much of today's social media. Their varying forms of advertising often obscures who the actual owner or funder is. Clearly, some of the companies in this media have begun to make some progress in generating advertiser information and blocking purveyors of misinformation. Our organization has had the dubious opportunity to witness the varying attempts by Facebook in this regard. Nonetheless, we have seen progress on this front by both Facebook and Twitter. However, we still have a considerable way to go. Plus, there are some other companies that are emerging as viable election social media campaign. TikTok is a good example of the newer entrants. Their efforts to address these problems remain to be seen, and unfortunately, the 2022 general election is fast approaching. So you might be asking yourself why we even tolerate secret money in our elections in the first place. Well, in this case, you have to blame the judges, especially the Supreme Court judges. The Supreme Court of the United States, better known as SCOTUS, as a result of a dozen or so of its decisions since 1976, it's pretty much eliminated the kinds of limits we used to have. The court's primary frame of reference is as follows. If you are acting and speaking independently of a candidate's election campaign, that is, you're separate from it, you're really simply exercising your First Amendment right of speech. There's also your right to freely assemble with others who feel as you do. The Supreme Court, however, took a big leap beyond this that numerous opinion surveys tell us that over 75% of the Americans disagree with it, that concluded the following. Since political speech requires money to disperse it, money is an essential component to speech. Accordingly, it too shall not be limited in our elections. That, ladies and gentlemen, is how we got into this mess of runaway big money and dark money in our elections. A key condition in their granting unlimited speech and money to such groups is that the speaker must do so independently of the candidate and or the candidate's campaign. In the case of one of the 501Cs, the fours particularly, their independence requires that they do not and cannot take actions and disseminate messages that explicitly tell people to vote for their preferred candidate. They can advocate for the candidate by pointing out the good things she and he has done, or for the issues they stand for, but no talking about voting for the candidate. And of course, trashing the record of the challenger to one's preferred candidate is not telling the voting public to vote for anyone, but it sure helps their desired candidate. Now you know why there's a lot of trash talk in an election by outside groups. It's not just their belligerency. Doesn't take a lot of savvy to understand that praising a candidate sure does not hurt his or her candidacy. Obviously, it helps. It's a veiled way of saying we need this person as our representative. However, legal evaluations rarely consider the practical likelihoods of this kind of speech. If there's not any word of vote in the statement, then there's no legal trouble. So let's take a deeper look at the 501c4 and its independent cousin, the super PAC. Technically speaking, the super PAC must report its donors, but you're about to see why their reporting is getting less and less transparent. So let's start with the super PACs. Here we have a group known as the Great Tomorrow USA PAC. Well, that group must report to the FEC quarterly on their donors and expenditures. If the campaign went for a state office, they'd be reporting to the Michigan Secretary of State. The super PAC can accept any amount of money from almost anyone, but no foreign money, and can spend any amount of that money on an election and can urge voting for the candidate. This lack of limits, plus being able to tell people to actually vote for the candidate, is what makes super PACs desirable and very numerous. In comparison, donations to a candidate committee have specific limits, and looking at the 501c4s, they can't tell people how to vote. Again, to get these kind of freedoms, they must be independent of the candidate, and they have to report. However, there's a lot of argument about the level of independence here because they are often operated by former campaign staff for the candidate. Now, fair question as far as I'm concerned. How independent are these guys? One of the newer players in our elections that became very popular thanks to the infamous Go to Citizens United case is the 501c4s, better known as the social welfare nonprofits. Here we have the Great Tomorrow USA Action Group. Nonprofit organizations have recently gotten into the election game in a very big way. 501c4 organizations are regulated by the Internal Revenue Service, or the IRS, not the FEC. A normal part of the activity of a social welfare organization is to advocate for the issues that they're concerned about. Given the involvement of the federal government and the welfare of individuals and communities, it's not particularly surprising that these groups have gotten into election politics. So the rate of growth by this money currently in American elections is nearly geometric. And while they've been, prohibited from making election advocacy a predominant part of their activity, the current reality is many of these groups spend large portions of their funding in the election. This is largely due to the fact that Congress has not given IRS sufficient funding to audit these organizations. The key thing to understand about these groups is that they are allowed to keep their donors secret, and most do just that. So here's our two organizations next to each other. You may have noticed that their names bear a strong resemblance to one another. Well, that's because the same organization has set them up. Indeed, they likely share staff and are frequently located at the same address, maybe even the same floor. A handful of very politically active individuals, often long-term party activists, typically set up these two organizations. By the way, while these names are fictitious, they bear a very strong resemblance to two very real political funding organizations. When this is the case, you can be sure that they support the same candidate. So it's realistic to represent them as being part of each other. When we get to talking about how the campaign directs its prospective donors, you'll see why. So here are our two linked groups. As we pointed out earlier, the super PAC must report to all of its donors and their donations. And that reporting is to the Federal Elections Commission for federal races. Well, okay. In this case, the Great Tomorrow USA PAC has already reported that they received a donation from John Smith, and the amount would be also reported. For illustration purposes, we're just showing the name to make it simpler. As we know now, the nonprofit will not be reporting on its donors. Notice that the window on the the Great Tomorrow USA Action 501c4 has been darkened. That's because they're not releasing information on their donors. We have organized, now that we've kind of specced out these organizations, let's see how the political money laundering happens in this particular scenario. So let's have Bill Jones enter our little picture. He would like to donate $50,000 to the super PAC. And of course, he knows that his donation will be public. Notice that Bill Jones's donation has been posted already. Has been added to the one that was already posted by John Smith. Now in this scene, Bob Devy, he's so devious that he shortened his real name, his real last name that is, which is devious. He's shortened it to Devy, also wishes to make a donation of $50,000 to the super PAC. And however, he doesn't want that donation to be he wants that donation to be secret. We know that a super PAC cannot have secret donations, and so does Bob Devy. So Bob Devy chooses to make his donation to the 501c4, the Great Tomorrow USA Action. Not long thereafter, Susie from the 501c4 transfers $200,000 to the super PAC. Within that bundle of money is Bob Devy's $50,000. By now you understand that what will be reported by the super PAC, its next quarterly report to the FEC, is that they received $200,000 donation from the 501c4 Great Tomorrow USA Action. Not that Bob Devy and the others were the real sources of the $200,000 to the super PAC. Rest assured that the super PAC usually knows that Bob Devy's $50,000 donation is part of that $200,000. So what's happened here? Well, Bob Devy gave $50,000 to a super PAC, ultimately, without the voting public having any idea that a person with his history and interests was backing the messages that the super PAC was broadcasting during the election. Now, those messages might be support for the candidate, or they might be oppositional messages on the candidate's challenger. Clearly, this is impairing the voter's basic right to be able to accurately weigh the competing candidate claims and to determine the likely interests each candidate is going to represent once elected. As you can see, 501c4s, social welfare groups, are major political money laundering machines in America. So we've seen some very strong relationships between the 501c4 and the super PACs. Now let's see if they have relationships with the candidates. Well, there are three primary actors in the candidate fundraising scene. You got to have a donor, that's for sure. And there is the candidate who's seeking funding. And then there is this very special person, the campaign money manager. Keep in mind that if a truly big donation is being sought from or being intended by the donor, the appeal needs to be made by the candidate. Please note that this is the beginning of the special accessibility privileges that big donors expect for their investment in the election. The key to the money flow, especially with large donations in the election, is the campaign money manager. Let's call him CMM. This is the individual who informs the potential donor of the options that she or he has for contributing to the election of the candidate. In addition to the CMM, it's perfectly legal, at least for the present, for the candidate to also inform potential donors of all three of these options. It is also currently legal for candidates to make speeches for the super PAC or for the 501c4. HR 1 in Congress would have prohibited this had it passed in January of 23 in the United States Senate. Generally, given the limits that are set on it, there are the amount of money that an individual organization can give a candidate committee is pretty limited. So as a result, the candidate campaign committee is for the smaller donors. All donations to these committees are reported to state and federal officials, and it is readily available for public viewing on the web. If the donor wants his large donation to be confidential, he's going to get steered to the 501c4. The 501c4 can accept any donation of any size. And as you know now, they do not divulge their donors to the IRS or any other public group. However, you can rest assured that the CMM has been informed by the 501c4 on the money it receives, and he's passed that information on to the candidate. This communicating with the CMM is just fine with the donors to the 501c4. After all, big money is donated with big expectations by the donor. It's essential that the candidate, once elected, is aware of their donation. The transfers that the 501c makes to the super PAC are perfectly legal, as we have already pointed out. For that large donor that wishes for the world to know of his donation, he is advised to donate to the Great Tomorrow USA PAC. Sky's the limit here, and every donation is reported. So I got some important questions for us to think about for a moment here. Do you think the candidate knows who gave money to the independent groups? Yep, that's a sure fact. Do you think that the voters in the election know who is bankrolling campaign messages broadcasted by the for or the super PAC? The answer is not a chance. Okay, now let's switch our focus to the second one on the list, the donor-directed funds, and how they hide the identity of donors, and catch this, give these political donations a tax deduction. So first off, there is the political money 501c3 foundations. And here we have Donors Trust. And as the title of this slide makes clear, these are not 501c4 nonprofits. They are 501c3 charities. Yes, they have been classified in the same group as your church, your son's Boy Scout troop, the Red Cross, and many other groups doing charitable work in our communities. And like those other groups, every nickel they receive is potentially tax deductible. Please forgive me if this feature of our political money laundering is raising your blood pressure, because I know it always raises mine. I'll explain how this money gets political in just a minute, but first, let's check the landscape of these political 501c3s. All the major political groups have one or more of these funds available for political donations. The conservatives have Donors Trust and some other entities. Liberals have their New Venture Fund and the 1630 Fund. Now, these funds are both of these types of funds are very clearly politically aligned, and the organizations that they fund must fit their philosophical and political profile. In that sense, and that sense only, they reflect the way the truly charitable groups operate. Generally, only large donors use these vehicles. Donors, and by the way, the majors on this one are these two. Donors Trust, which put in $162 million worth of grants in 2018, and the New Venture Fund put in 171 million of grants in the 2018 election. Frequently, donors are allowed to designate the recipient of their donation. Typically, the donor must select from the authorized list that's been set up by the 501c3. However, larger donors can suggest alternative organizations that must still align with the philosophy of the 501c3. And as we've pointed out, the IRS regulations restrict these threes, granting to only 501c3s. Plus, 501c3s can engage in advocacy on a very limited basis, less than 20% of their resources. But these folks have figured out a way to get around this limit. More on that in just a little bit. At the very start, the identity of the donor is lost because it starts with a dark organization. This is the 501c political foundation, Donors Trust. As a charitable, they don't have to reveal their donors, and these guys don't. So here comes Bob Devious's brother Bill. Like his brother, he does not want anyone to know that he's going to donate $500,000 to the campaign of Represent Al Do Anything of money. So Bob leaves with an acknowledgement of his donation. He will carefully file it when he gets home because it is probably worth $50,000 to $100,000 in potential tax deductions. As we pointed out earlier, Donors Trust has a pre-approved listing of groups who they will transfer funds to, who are part of an extensive network of groups that endorse the philosophy contained in the charter of the 301 and both 301s, 301Cs. If Bill Divvy has other ideas on groups that should get his money, he may be able to have Donors Trust add that to their list if the philosophies align. As it turns out, Bill wants to have the money given to a group that will ultimately be able to pass it on to his favorite 501c4, who we're about to meet. Donors Trust is limited by law to make grants only to 501c3s. Fortunately for Bill, they have just such a group, Education and Advocacy for Way of Life. By the way, did you notice that we've seen a very similar named group like this before? Donors Trust, like Donors Trust, this is a dark money group. All that appears on their grant check that they receive is the name of Donors Trust. So Bill's money is transferred to the second 501c3, and no one can legally obtain a record to reveal who the original donor was. Well, this second tier of 501c3s in this political money laundering process is another of the politically oriented nonprofits that focus on advocacy and education on their issue. The role of the second in this instance, the education and advocacy for our way of life, is to get the donor's money into the political process and to get it to be and to get part of it ready to enter in and influence the election. Needless to say, this second 501c3 is a very important link in this laundering process. They do this by taking in money from various donors and then making grants to a whole range of political actor or groups on their philosophy. And remember, they always must conform to views of donors' trust and its original donors. Probably the most important receivers of grants from these 501c3s is 501c4s, who are focused on the issue that the 501c3 is concerned about as it pertains to one or more election races. It is understood that I'll Do Anything is one of the races that they are focused on. They also do a considerable amount of advertising on their issue. They also fund specialized legal firms that help develop and promote federal and state legislation. They fund firms that craft strategies to frame their issues in ways that increase the likelihood that they can further their political objectives through successful litigation in the courts. They also pursue that litigation or submit amicus filings that reflect their supportive or objecting views on that litigation. They put on conferences around their issues, and they frequently spotlight their supported candidates with speaking opportunities that include honorariums. They fund research reports on their issues, and they're typically generated by academics or researchers sympathetic to the 501c3's point of view. And these groups are generally good at using social media and often help groups in their network to make better effective use of social media. So here again is our politically oriented 501c3 that we just talked about. And here is the 501c4 action for our way of life that engages in elections that are focusing on their issues and political views. To make it easier to follow a narrative, their sign is going to be green. The second 501c3 with the blue sign has a written agreement with the 501c4 that stipulates that the 501c4 can only use grants from the three for purposes that do not violate the restrictions set upon the three by the IRS. That is, the second 501c3's money that it granted to the 501c4 is not supposed to finance messages that tells people to vote for a specific candidate. Now, because the 501c4 places in a single account all the donations they get that are direct from Bob and his brother Bill, Debbie, as well as the transfer grants that they get from 501c3 nonprofits. Since they're in the same account, any ability to closely track the agreement compliance with the three is pretty well shot. Changing this, requiring the 501c4 to use separate accounts for their election activity is one of the key elements in Michigan's MIFTI legislative strategy. No one really sweats the details here in truth, as the IRS staffing levels for a very long time have been woefully underfunded by Congress. Pretty convenient, don't you think? Congress has an incredible conflict of interest in this whole arrangement. Okay, so we now focus on the 501c4 because there's a very important fact here that they are the linchpin, in effect, a gateway for the donors' trust money to finally get into the election. Let's see how that happens. As we touched on earlier, the 501c4 can only use the grant money that they got on issue advocacy that advances that candidate, I'll Do Anything, is using in his campaign. Since ads lavish great praise on the desired candidate, thereby significantly improving their candidate's electability. Of course, the group may more likely push out messaging that trashes or impugns the integrity of the desired candidate's opponent. Again, providing messages that helps the preferred candidate. This is where dog whistles and campaign emotions and campaign war terms come into play. If the 501c4 uses them, they tap right into the voters' election emotions without even citing the election. And we all know and have learned to appreciate recently the power of election emotions. Pretty nice trick, eh? The 501c4 can spend their entire funds from any source in this particular manner if they so choose. Now, the red segment that we are illustrating here illustrates where monies are given, that the 501c4 has the right to give money to a super PAC that broadcasts candidate-specific election messaging. The reality, however, is spending money in this direction can only be spent, if you will, at a rate of not more than 50% of the funds that the 501c4 has. It also points out, again, the value of the culture wars. Now, let's see, moving along now. Here, folks, is America's tax-supported political money laundering machine built for the big money donors. The 501c3s are in blue, the 501c4s are in green, and the super PACs are in tan. Remember now, your tax dollars are subsidizing large-scale political contributions handled in this system, and it's all secret money. Our third listed source of dark money is the limited liability corporation. Now, generally, these are set up by individuals to make political donations. There's no data on how prevalent they are these days, and generally they're perceived as waning in deference to the more desirable use of 501c4s to accomplish secrecy. However, we have a new development, and that is in 2021, Boris Seed, CEO of Trip Light, forever changed the landscape of what could be done politically with an LLC money. So what we're going to talk about now is major tax avoidance for a mega political donation. This is a story of how an uber wealthy business owner turned a massive long-term personal financial gain, better known as profit, into a tax-free political donation. First, he created an irrevocable trust, which in most cases is an LLC. Then he transferred his entire holding in his company into the trust. His shares of the company had grown in value to $1.6 billion. Later, he established a 501c4 known as the Marble Freedom Trust. And then later after that, the LLC trust transferred, and this transfer is legally considered a gift, which is normally taxed on any amount that is over $15,000. So the trust transferred $1.6 billion in Trip Light shares to the politically oriented 501c4. However, thanks to an arcane tax law in 2015, that tax law exempts from the gift tax any amount given to the politically active nonprofits, the fours, the fives, and the sixes. Congress, once again, is feathering their own political nest. You may be wondering how dark this money could have been given the information we now have in this case. We only have these facts because three intrepid reporters from two different news agencies worked their tails off following the breadcrumbs. let's pause for just a minute and consider the political calculus that went into this very significant door that was flung open to the uber wealthy influence over our elections. At the very same time as the flood of money in our politics was massively increasing in 2015 and later, it was determined that we needed more and more money, and that the government would go even further and give that money a tax break. Pretty amazing, eh? Okay, let's return to our scene of uber wealth, transitioning to oligarchical political influence. That 1.6 billion asset is sitting in the 501c4. It can be sold and not be subject to taxes. Yet again, not surprisingly, Seed's 1.6 billion in assets avoids any tax. Under normal ownership, the amount of tax that was avoided was worth nearly $500 million. Consider for a moment what kinds of common good might have been generated by the government from $500 million in tax revenue. Or, seen from another perspective, consider the failure of that gain to reasonably compensate the taxpayers that created and financed various public services that helped make Triplite successful in the first place. All right, so now we're going to look at the fourth item in our list, that reporting dodge known as last-minute transactions. So the first thing to keep in mind is that this gambit applies to organizations that must report their donors. That includes candidate committees, some political action groups and their committees, and super PACs. The place they must report to all depends on the nature of the office being sought by the candidate. If it's a state or local office, the reporting is done to the Michigan Secretary of State. If it's a federal office, then the reporting is done to the Federal Elections Commission. For our purposes right now, we'll use the Michigan Secretary of State's reporting schedule. It runs every couple of months, as you can see. The date in red is this year's general election, November 8th. Just above it is the last required report before the election. It's October 20th, which leaves a window of 18 days before the election. And it is a very active window in an election campaign. So how busy is that 18-day window, you ask? First of all, and most importantly, campaigns are going flat out for the election day. The time is almost up. The greatest surge in advertising takes place during this period. And then the advertising during this time is the most incendiary of the entire election cycle. So this data in these 18 days becomes available when it's no longer useful after the election is long over. Practically speaking, this is dark money in the election. So we now know some of the sadly legal processes that produces secret money. The next question is, how big is this problem? I'll give you a hint. It's big, and it's getting bigger with every election. Not surprisingly, with the onset of politically active 501c4s, the transparent money, which is the white columns on this table, in the super PACs starts to grow gray, going dark. That is, it's no longer donor specific. It's using the processes we just discussed. So this is proof that big money is indeed going dark. So let's talk about election money closer to home. Here in Michigan, our races are getting dominated by big dark money. At $20.8 million, dark money was the biggest class of money in the 2018 governor's election. Now let's look at Michigan's congressional elections. The blue bar shows the total spent doubled over just 2 years. The orange bars show that the costs of the 6 most expensive districts, and that increase was an explosion of 300%. It was tripled. The golden arrow box clarifies that nearly half of that growth in the expensive districts was in a single election, the 8th district, with Slotkin versus Bishop, the incumbent. A significant source of this growth was dark money. This race was targeted as a national priority race by both parties. Let's move on to dark money overall in the federal election in 2020. This is the data from that election. And this is only the money that can be traced. So we know it's bigger than this. There is an unknown amount of dark money that can't be located. However, this was able to be tracked by Open Secrets, and it's $1 billion, and it is near the doubling of the amount that was estimated in 2016. By the way, the entire 2020 federal election expenditure is estimated at about $15.6 billion. Over half of this money, $660 million, is transfers to political groups, generally the super PACs, all part of that laundering machine we just talked about. About a third of this money, or $132 million, was spent on traditional and social media advertising. Dark money has totally invaded the activity of our Supreme Court. And while these justices are not elected, the process has now become captive to dark money. The conservative Federalist Society is the biggest source of dark money here. Dark money finds candidates. Dark money selects nominees. They provide the president with final lists of preferred candidates. Dark money also promotes nominees with extensive national advertising in home districts of the U.S. senators who sit on the decisive Senate Judiciary Committee. Dark money has now begun to advise the selected committee on how to conduct themselves in their nomination hearings in Congress. As we discussed a while ago, these dark money groups bring cases before the court and pay for so-called independent amici filings to support the views in their cases. Now, my audience doesn't have to take my word on this assault on the independence and fairness of our judiciary. I strongly encourage folks to check out the presentation made by U.S. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse during the 2020 Barrett nomination hearing. I've included the URL, and it's also fairly easy to simply search in YouTube to find it. So I have a few important questions for everyone listening to this presentation. First, does this information upset you? Do you think this has gone on long enough? Well, we've had enough. Do you feel a need to do something about this? We're taking action right now in the state of Michigan. Does the situation look or feel overwhelming? Well, that's understandable, but it doesn't have to be. There are meaningful things that can be done. Stay with me a little longer and I'll explain them to you. As you might have guessed by now, we believe that we've got some serious remodeling to do to our election finance practices. All people and organizations in the election must report finances and messages. We must have transparency. All office holders and candidates must report their financial interests. All 501c4s, et cetera, must separately record election financial activity and report that, like all other election participants. And we also want to be restoring the ability of state and federal governments to set reasonable campaign limits. Keep in mind, we're not expanding the role of government, we're restoring it. To get something done, you got to have a plan, and we do. This one's tailored to Michigan. And the key in our approach may shift a little bit as political events around us impact it. So we got kind of a path, but it's a stepwise progression of things that we know will get the job done. And the key activity right now is to educate our constituency on the practical measures that can be undertaken and engage them in action right now. And in fact, by listening to this presentation, you are experiencing the process that's our first step. We are now working with constituents across the state to advocate with their local governments to consider and pass resolutions calling for action by our legislators in Lansing. And in this way, our entire communities will be able to speak on this important issue. Currently, we're working with other constituents to lobby their congresspersons to support the disclosed bill that's currently before the U.S. House and to support the federal constitutional amendment to restore our ability to set reasonable donation limits. To increase our pressure on our congresspersons, the local resolution I just referred to also includes a second resolve that calls for local unit of government to request their congresspersons to support the amendment and to restore setting campaign donation limits. So those green items above are the three things going on right now that everyone can engage in. But we need everybody and interested to help us make this happen. As we ramp up the number of local resolutions that we gather, the second bullet above, from many parts of the state, we can begin to talk with the Michigan legislature with authority and backing about the legislation that the state must have. Unless we have a change in the leadership of our state legislature, we are not optimistic about securing meaningful legislation. So, if the legislative route proves not productive, then we'll pursue a voter ballot measure, just like the one that the state did with gerrymandering in 2018. The earliest we can foresee this taking place is in the 24 election. And because we foresee having to go this direction, this transparency ballot measure is already about 90% written. Now, with all this activity having taken place for a couple or more years, the legislature will surely clearly understand the will of Michiganders on this topic and will swiftly ratify the proposed U.S. constitutional amendment that restores our ability to set reasonable campaign finance limits. The current aspirational target for Congress to provide this amendment to the states is 2027. So what are the key things that are contained in that transparency measure and what we're fighting for? First, anyone or any election active entity must report its donors and expenditures if those messages communicate to the general public, if they spend more than $1,000 cumulatively on such messages, if they publish those messages during the period of 120 days before the primary through the general election, which basically means the window would start in May and go through the election. And importantly, the message needs to be, the topic of the message needs to be the election or support for a candidate. And also, the funders in a specific communication need to be reported. Also, lobbyist services to candidates and funders need to report their activity. All candidates and office holders must annually report their financial interests, and all executive branch employees must also report their financial interests. Our big ask today is for you to join our effort to secure and volunteer as an advocate to secure our local resolutions, which those resolutions are known as the People Must Govern, Not Money resolutions. The resolution tells the Michigan legislature that your community demands transparency in our election finance and messaging. In like fashion, it tells your congressional delegation to work for passage of the federal amendment to restore our right to set limits in campaign finances. If you feel that you are not able to serve as an advocate, but you want to be involved, you can make a donation to this local resolution effort at the URL link that is now displayed at the bottom of this slide. In doing that, we want to make it clear that you're not going to be by yourself. We know that some people consider advocating for local government as a rather intimidating task. There's lots of help and camaraderie that we offer with this activity. For instance, you'll be provided with a mentor whose job it is to help explain the process and to understand and respond to whatever you feel you need to be successful. We'll help you assemble a team if you desire. We have a model resolution that you can start with, or you can build your own, and we have materials to help you do just that. We can help you with your publicity. And that about wraps up what I want to talk about with you today. Thanks for spending the time with us, learning about the scourge of dark money in our elections and what can be done about it. We welcome your questions. You can use any of the contact methods you see on this slide to reach us. We'd love to learn of your potential interest in joining our activities. Just let us know by using those same listed contact methods. If you want to follow us, you can sign up for our periodic newsletter or simply follow us on the 3 social media listed on the right. I've also provided at the bottom of this slide, again, the donation link if you wish to help fund this important effort to restore transparency to Michigan's elections. Finally, you have our sincere thanks for caring about the health of our elections and politics. There's a lot of work to be done. So this is Hank Mayers wishing you a good night from Michiganders for fair and transparent elections.